Welcome, people of planet Earth and all planets beyond. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and today we're going to talk about Fruit of the Loom vintage tags and how to identify them. Let's get into it. Now, Fruit of the Loom is a really old company, over 100 years old, maybe even over 150 years old. So there are plenty of tags that we're just not going to be able to talk about because they are so old. They are in the business of primarily like generic textiles, so underwear, socks, but they did do a lot more creative stuff over the years. Again, they've been around for a very long time, so they've had plenty of time to do it. But we're going to focus on specifically here today is their blank t-shirts that ended up being printed on as t-shirt printing became far more popular in the late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. So we're going to start there and focus on that. We'll make more videos detailing a bunch of other tags and how to identify and date any of those tags. But today we're going to talk about Fruit of the Loom. All right, now before we begin, it's important to remember the way that this industry works. Fruit of the Loom makes a bunch of blank t-shirts and then distributes them to screen printers, and screen printers print their t-shirts for clients. And that means there were inventories of all of these different types of tags. So while we might see a particular tag that primarily is seen in a certain range of time, because inventories get used up at different rates, you might find a t-shirt that primarily was printed on in the early 90s, but somehow you find it printed on, a 1997, church camp t-shirt. I mean, you just never know. So you do need to remember that there are exceptions to almost every one of these rules, and it's important to know that we're looking more at ranges rather than hard dates. Now, the reason we're focused on the 70s, 80s, and 90s is because, generally speaking, that's when the graphic t-shirt really took off. Prior to that, Fruit of the Loom may have produced t-shirts, but they were mostly just blanks. They weren't intended to be printed on. They weren't intended to be advertisements or sort of associated with any one thing. So while there are some exceptions to that, largely speaking, this is the case. So let's go ahead and look at some of the older Fruit of the Loom tags that you might find most likely on blanks or other generic garments, not necessarily related to vintage graphic t-shirts. Now, to begin, let's look at a 1950s tag right here. Notice it does say Sanfordized, which is a really common word that we don't ever use anymore. It just basically means pre-shrunk. It's already been washed to be shrunk, so you don't have to worry about it shrinking too much. Much more commonly used in the 50s, 60s, and 70s than any other time. After that, I think we just basically said pre-shrunk. Next, here are a couple that you might find in the 50s and the 60s. They're all relatively similar. They all have the fruit and the fruit cornucopia basket, Fruit of the Loom being present. There are lots of different small variations around this time. But note, if you see any of these, you're probably looking at a garment from the 60s or the 50s. Now, getting into the 70s, we have mostly the same sort of design. It doesn't get too different here. Though there is sort of a notable difference towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s. You go from sort of an oil-painted logo to a more bold, simple color palette for the Fruit of the Loom logo. That sort of carries on for the next 20, 30 years or so for Fruit of the Loom, as they sort of got rid of the vestiges of the old Fruit of the Loom logo. Now, as we get to the 80s, the graphic t-shirt really takes off. Video games, bands, your high school, everybody was printing their own t-shirts. And around this time, Fruit of the Loom actually started a sub-brand called Screen Stars, and a lot of their blank t-shirts in the 80s were printed on Screen Stars. So while you might find a few Fruit of the Loom tags like this in the 80s, primarily Fruit of the Loom tags were Screen Stars. So you'll find a lot of Screen Stars tees throughout the 80s. Now, I'm going to do Screen Stars in a separate video, so let's put that in the back burner for now and just realize that some of these examples here are the Fruit of the Loom tags you might find in the 80s. But where it really gets interesting and where Fruit of the Loom really takes off is the 90s. And so around 1989, Fruit of the Loom sort of shut down Screen Stars and replaced the Screen Stars blanks with Fruit of the Loom tags. And this was one of the first Fruit of the Loom tags that they replaced it with. This is sort of, in a lot of people's opinion, perhaps the best of all Fruit of the Loom vintage t-shirt tags. People tend to love this particular design, so let's take a look at one of them right here. This one right here is actually a early 90s, I think this says 1991 right here on this particular t-shirt. And it has the Fruit of the Loom tag, says Made in USA, and is 100% cotton, which is actually kind of interesting because through the 80s, the 50-50 blends became wildly popular. It's actually where we get that super thin looking feel, because the cotton would actually start separating and washing away from the polyester, leaving mostly a polyester, which gave us that super thin feel. The 100% cotton started coming back in the 90s. This is one of those examples. Wonderful t-shirt. People tend to love this particular tag and the way that these t-shirts fit. They're a little bit longer, and they are single stitch, as all these t-shirts should be, generally speaking, this early on in the 90s. But a fantastic t-shirt. Now that Fruit of the Loom tag seems to run somewhere between 1989, 90, all the way into maybe 1993, 94. And again, you can have exceptions there. That sort of is the rule. Now the next tag that sort of came on the scene was this black tag. And you'll notice that it actually has a particular similarity to the Screen Stars tag. And that's because they sort of morphed the Screen Stars stuff into the Fruit of the Loom branding and sort of combine the two. So you had Screen Stars Best, now you have Best Fruit of the Loom. And we have this t-shirt right here, the black label t-shirt, Made in USA. This one is 50% cotton and poly and is single stitched. This black one ran probably sort of starting like 93 into like 95, 96. You could kind of find them in all of those ranges. Again, remember that once these were produced and they entered the inventories of a bunch of different screen printers, they just worked through them. So you might find some of these much older or more earlier than sort of that middle range. Now, next on the scene was sort of a reprise of that original earlier Fruit of the Loom white tag. And that's this one right here. A little bit longer, but notice that it does not say Made in America. That's because after NAFTA, all the outsourcing started to happen across the entire textile industry. And these, while they do have the same look and feel as the earlier 90s one, they are made out of the country. These were sort of right in the middle to started bleeding into the late 90s, so middle to late 90s on this particular tag. Alright, now here is a tag that I actually don't have an example of. I've had it in the past, but it's this Fruit of the Loom blue tag. This seems to be sort of situated right in the middle of all of these tags in the mid 90s. So if you find one of these tags, it's likely it's got a 94, 95, 96 origin of production. Now you'll start to notice that into the late 90s, the Fruit of the Loom tag started to become multiple tags. So there was a label, and then there was like all the care instructions. So as you move into the late 90s, we get more tags, and they are a little bit larger. So let's take a look at one of the next tags we want to look at, and it's this guy right here. This is a Fruit of the Loom Best tag. Now this probably runs, because you can actually see right here it says 1996. This one probably runs around 96 specifically. This one's pretty cool because 96 is when you started seeing companies move away from the single stitch. But this 96 was actually one of the last ones probably produced under the Fruit of the Loom Best tag. This does have an approximate date. It does seem to run potentially even into 95, maybe. Probably not earlier than that, but 96 on this one. And this one runs, because there's actually a couple different variations of this particular tag. So let's take a look at another one that's very similar. Right here we have a Fruit of the Loom Best again, but this time it is double stitched. Now, because it's double stitch, this leads me to believe this is late 90s, probably 97, 98, 99. on this particular tag. It is assembled outside of the country in Mexico of U.S. fabric, which is sort of a common thing that they said sort of in that late 90s period when they were trying to sort of still appeal to the fact that there was something to do with American production still into these t-shirts. But this one you can actually see is a 50-50 cotton blend, poly cotton blend, but it is double stitched, so it's probably from the late 90s after 1996. And furthermore, we can still see that same tag, the Fruit of the Loom Best tag, used into 2000. This is a Cub Scouts 2000 t-shirt. So this Fruit of the Loom Best tag replaced obviously that black Fruit of the Loom Best tag, and after 1996 became a double stitched t-shirt. Now the next tag we're going to look at is the Fruit of the Loom Heavy. Whereas the Fruit of the Loom Best was typically a poly cotton blend, this one is 100% cotton. And so it definitely had a thicker, heavier feel than the poly cotton blend, which was much lighter. This one right here is single stitched, made in USA. So you know this is probably 95, 96 itself. This design again took over around that time, and the heavy tag actually went on to be used for quite some time as well. We actually have a few more of the heavy example right here. We have one. This Neil McCoy. Is this Neil McCoy? Yeah, Neil McCoy. But this one's interesting, even though it's on the Fruit of the Loom Heavy Cotton tag. It's made in Mexico and it's double stitched. This right here, I think this tour actually happened in like 98. So this is a clear example of the difference between the pre-1996 single stitch versions of the heavy cotton tag and the afterwards, the double stitched heavy cotton made outside of the United States. Here's one of those heavy cottons again, one more time, made in Honduras, double stitch right here. But we actually know that this is from 1998, so we can be pretty confident that this is from around that time and giving us a pretty firm date on this particular t-shirt. So here's one more of the Fruit of the Loom heavy cotton t-shirts. This one actually is, let's say, as it says, 99% cotton, so there was probably some other random fiber in here. But what's interesting about this is that we have a copyright date on this art of 1998, but this is still a single stitch t-shirt, and this was made outside the United States in El Salvador. So what's interesting here is that you do have a t-shirt that's still old, that seems to be been produced either after 1996 or was dead stock and sat in inventory for a long time. That is single stitch, but still on that heavy cotton blend tag that was indicative of the late 90s. So you can find it in that variation as well. Here we have another Fruit of the Loom tag from the late 90s. This is the Fruit of the Loom Loft Tees, 100% cotton. Seems it was made in USA, double stitch. And so this was, we can actually tell exactly when this was. This was from some sort of tour in 1997. So clearly after sort of the 1996 cutoff, this was most likely a pretty common t-shirt you would find in the late 90s into the early 2000s. So that's kind of the Loft Tees tag right here. That's its range. Now all of those tags could run you into the early 2000s. So you might see one here or there. But this one right here sort of seems to have taken over in the early 2000s and really diverges from the rest of those that sort of share their late 90s heritage. This one seems to only exist in the around like 2003, 2004 era, and it's this version of the Fruit of the Loom heavy cotton t-shirt made in El Salvador, double stitch. This was probably just some blank that somebody did a tie-dye of, which is a super dope tie-dye. I can't remember where I found it, but it was super dope. Definitely had to have it. You can kind of see something. Oh, that's kind of cool. Anyway, cool t-shirt, whichever way you have it. But this tag right here would be indicative of the early 2000s and unlikely to have any relationship to a tee that was earlier than that. Now remember that tags can really only get you to an approximate range. You need to use other markers like copyright dates, or if there's like a tour date on it, or if it's single or double stitch. Use those tools to help you get to a more finer and smaller, narrower window of production. If you need more information about vintage t-shirts and how to identify them, check out the video in the eye above, where I go all over a bunch of different ways to identify vintage t-shirts. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you like vintage thrift content like this, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.